someone please message me? Cool. So someone just message at any point if that situation changes. Without further ado, we can just start the round. Remember also to check the chats for POIs. Yeah, great. Good luck, everyone.
We think it's terrible that the Chinese government is getting insight into the data, news preferences, and communication networks of millions of people who make up Western voting bodies. We want to put a stop to this and will ban all Chinese social media apps. A model and then 3 claims. Firstly, why this poses a threat to our data. Secondly, why it harms the kind of content that we see. And then thirdly, characterizing why Chinese retaliation is unlikely to be large, but even if it happens, we do not care. Into our model. Firstly, we would kick them out from like all countries that are not China around the world. In terms of how we would do this, it would be either A, like an outright ban, so you would just prevent consumers from being able to access this like legally, or secondly, we would support a fire sale of Chinese companies to domestic corporations, which is currently being proposed in the United States to like sell TikTok to a US company. This debate is also taking place from like an actor neutral perspective, so not from Western governments, just like the average person outside of China. First claim, why does this pose a threat to our data? I think that the first thing I want to characterize here is why this is like the exclusive / important way for Chinese to have access to our data relative to other things. The first thing to say here is that they get mass access to what consumer preferences and consumer psyches on the ground actually are. Different from like a retail app, this is, in terms of a clarification, I will go.
Yeah, cool. Would you also support the sale of shares from like companies like Tencent in gaming companies like Epic Games and so on and so forth, other stakes they have in different American companies?
Like probably principally yes. We just think that social media is like the most important. I don't think that we have to defend that. So first, we get a mass access to preferences. Unlike like other Chinese companies that may deal with like infrastructure things or like selling products overseas, this is detailed insight into what the psyches of the average person actually are in terms of what we do on social media, right? It's about the kind of news that we access, how echo chambers tend to work, and the kind of people that we speak to. So as a consequence, they know what the average person within America or within every country just thinks about their world and what their outlook is going to be. Especially with young people, I think it's very powerful because you get to see the next generation of voters. Secondly, when you register for social media apps, it often requires you to give up personal information. So it's not just your name, but it's often like your postal code, like where you live, etc., that makes potentially tracking your identity and finding out other information about you via Google searches like substantially easier. You know, that people often don't go over user conditions particularly well, meaning it's not regulated particularly well as well. I think that thirdly, like apps are increasingly becoming vertically integrated, meaning that single social media apps become like linked to other things. So in a similar way to how Facebook and Instagram are linked to one another, Chinese social media apps are increasingly becoming linked to other companies. So by allowing Chinese ownership of this, it also becomes a gateway to access like broader webs of data that ultimately exist. I think the final reason why this is just like unique is the large quantities of time that people spend on social media relative to just like other ways that people tend to give up data. What then are the massive harms of China getting this data? A couple things. Firstly, this makes election meddling in the future substantially easier. This is because election meddling typically works when you give content to particular people to try and manipulate their interests, and really to what Russia did in the US presidential election. But when you have a more nuanced awareness what the average person actually thinks, you're able to target like their psychological weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, when you know what the most divisive issues are to a much larger extent. I think that secondly though, when China attempts to show us content via their own propaganda, like Chinese news states operating in Western countries or these apps directly, they can also target their own propaganda substantially more easily when they know the kind of things that individuals on the ground are going to be the most susceptible to. So in terms of why that's bad, A, it's like a principled manipulation of choice, but I think that B, it's like bad to elevate like governments who may have like a softer line to China overall and be less prone to like human rights, etc., just in terms of the actual policies that we get on the ground. Secondly, in certain individual cases, this can be utilized as a form of blackmail, i.e. if like the child of a senator was looking up LGBT content, you can use this to extract certain favors that are beneficial for China. I think that thirdly, this can often be used to target the Chinese American diaspora. So certain Chinese people in the American diaspora tried to look up pro-Western content on TikTok, received a variety of like threats that was just very harmful. I think that finally, this gives other Chinese corporations an asymmetric business advantage when they just know data of like millions of countries in like depth that is able to outcompete like the knowledge that other people have about data. Second argument, why does this worsen the kind of content that individuals on the ground see? Two things here. The first thing to say is that China both censors content and floods it with information that is beneficial to the interests of China. Norms about what is okay in China is substantially different in the West. They don't like democracy. They're less favorable to movements like feminism and Black Lives Matter, especially because they fear those kind of movements emerging domestically as well. So in terms of what then China does, they either like restrict this content outright, right? So like they flag content like Black Lives Matter as being like bad content or is violating some kind of procedure, and then they take it down from these sites. Two, they flood these sites with their own propaganda, i.e. China's like excellent COVID response flying over TikTok. Note that even if China does not do this explicitly, people self-censor to a larger extent, especially if like in countries that might be located closer to China, because they worry about the Chinese government having access to this kind of information. In terms of why this is harmful, I think that firstly, I just want to characterize something here briefly, which is that like Chinese apps are becoming more popular relative to US rivals. So you cannot just gather this information via either US apps. Firstly, these apps tend to be the most new like TikTok, and therefore they are the most exciting to like youth on the ground. So use them asymmetrically. But secondly, China is able to capitalize their industry substantially better than the West, given that they're often linked to like the state, like these are SOEs that are operating. So when you have a consistent large pool of state funding, they're going to be able to outcompete US companies to like a broader extent. So given this context, in terms of why this is bad, it means that A, it harms the ability of like individuals on the ground to access information, right? Like I think it's good for like people on the ground to know more about their identities, and these apps, given that they're used so much, is a vital way to do that. But secondly, more importantly, this is a way to like galvanize social awareness for important causes in a lot of circumstances, i.e. like when millions of people see content about Black Lives Matter, the next generation of people will care more about that. Thirdly, it's bad for like China to just influence our views about the world in terms of like more people will be pro-China if you consistently see China about like them doing good things, and it undermines a lot of norms about democracy being good that exist. Secondly, though, regulating apps overall is just more difficult. This is just like for things like normal like data requirements and stuff like that. This is because you don't have domestic jurisdiction over these companies. It's really expensive and legally convoluted to sue in foreign courts. Therefore, it's harder to get like privacy requirement legislation, just like addictive like requirement legislation that's really beneficial. In terms of some rebuttal, why is China unlikely to retaliate to that large of a degree? Firstly, right now, economically speaking, China is weaker due to COVID, and they would fear a counter retaliation. i.e. they don't want the US to like impose new sanctions relative to what China is doing to them, because that would weaken their own economy, potentially be bad domestically. Secondly, though, there'd be a large quantity of collective action for potential retaliation. This is because Chinese social media companies operate in like a lot of states, so it'll harm China's economy too much to literally sanction like the EU, the US, and every other state who has these apps, especially because if all these other states try to sanction back, it would be economically catastrophic to China. But thirdly, there's just like a threshold problem in terms of worsening a relationship. They already hate the US because of like Mang, they hate Canada because of Mang, they hate us because we're issuing like human rights over like Uyghurs. This would not be the unique thing that would harm their relationship. If like one more product is sanctioned, we quite frankly don't give a crap if it means the data of people being protected. I'm very proud to stand in opening government.
Cool, thank you. And now calling up the leader of the opposition.
All right, am I audible?
Yes.
Excellent. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at best, what we hear from opening government is a principled harm that people should have a right to control the information they get and a right to control their democracy. However, I think that this is clearly outweighed by the economic harms that we were going to claim will definitely happen as a result of Chinese retaliation. It's a very simple weighing here. Those things, like those rights, like the ability to control what information you have, the ability to explore your identity, etc., don't matter if you are not alive. It don't matter if you don't have a job, or don't matter if you have a terrible job that makes you work a very long time, 16 hours a day, and you don't have time to do those things anyway. We think that this is the most important thing in the debate, and when we win on this, we will win the debate from opening opposition. 3 things in this debate. Firstly, some rebuttal why data privacy just doesn't, won't even change that much, even if it did matter. Second of all, how China will react, and I'll respond to the pre-rebuttal we got from Naomi. And third, what the bad impacts of China's reaction are. So what is, so basically, why do we think that this won't be a big delta in terms of data privacy, even if that does matter. I think the biggest reason here is that China already buys like user data from Facebook en masse. They can do this from any social media website. That is to say that even if we were to ban TikTok tomorrow, it is not clear that China would have substantially less data on American and Western users of social media apps, because they can just get it from whatever other social media apps there are. And we hear this weird thing that's like, oh, like, you know, TikTok is like the newest thing. It's the most up and coming thing. Okay, sure. But when you ban it, something else will be new and upcoming. China will just buy their data. Now, maybe they can try to say that they'll ban that, but like, you know, those companies selling data to China. But the problem with that is that for a company like Facebook, Chinese firms buying this data is actually an enormous source of revenue. Like actually like a huge percentage of Facebook's revenue comes from this. What does that mean? That means, first of all, I just don't think Gov has the fiat power to do this at the point at which it would take substantially more political will, at the point at which there are hugely powerful and rich people in the West has a huge vested interest in not losing that massive source of revenue. But second, it means that even if they do manage to do that, it would have other substantial harms, basically meaning that these companies would have to charge a fee now, meaning that social media becomes far less accessible to everyone, something that I don't think they're likely to want to stand behind. Now, what they say in response to this, yeah, so that's why we don't think this will be a significant delta in terms of data privacy. I just don't think that this is the part that matters that much in the debate. Also, like, just in terms of what China does with the data, just to make sure it's clear that that doesn't matter, they say that this makes election meddling easier, but one, Russia literally already did this without having apps in America very effectively. It's not clear that it's necessary for that. And two, in terms of countries that aren't the US, China literally already blackmails African leaders. Like, it's just not clear that this is such a bad thing. And in terms of targeting propaganda, we think that, like, well, really, we think just everything else is made symmetrical by the fact that, like, they just buy data from Facebook anyway. And in terms of the content, I'll just briefly point out that China actually likes a lot of progressive content like Black Lives Matter because it makes America look bad. And, like, yes, maybe China sometimes spreads their propaganda, but they can do that through buying advertising slots on other social media companies like Facebook anyway, so that's probably fairly symmetrical. Okay, so why will China retaliate? I think there are basically two reasons. One, this would be a massive hit on Chinese revenue. A company like TikTok or WeChat is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, forming a substantial portion of China's economy. China wants to disincentivize things like this from happening in the future, and it makes China look incredibly weak if they just do nothing after America and the EU cut off, like, a huge significant point of their revenue, basically forcing a major SOE to go insolvent. They will not take this lying down. They want to disincentivize this in the future, and they don't want to appear weak. Secondly, we think that there are a lot of Western elites in China who have elites in China who have connections to the West, elites who have connections, for example, in Los Angeles, in Vancouver, who has business ties on the basis of these apps operating in the West. We think that at the point at which they no longer have these ties because the apps can't operate there anymore, they lose the incentive to push for things like an open economy, like fewer tariffs. The response that we hear to this is, like, firstly, like, China's economy is just too weak. But here's the thing. China actually handled COVID far, far better than either the US or the West did. And so China knows that any tariffs will harm the US and the West more than it harms China, meaning that they will be perfectly willing to do this. And, like, they say they already hate the US and Canada, and that may be true, but we think that, one, it makes it's a bad thing if ending the trade war becomes harder as a result of this, and two, they don't already hate the EU. We've heard no reason for that, and they're definitely currently not in a trade war with the EU, and so there is definitely room for things to get worse there. Yes, it might hurt China's economy to sanction every single other country, and it might hurt it to some extent, but one, China is handling COVID better, and their economy is actually stronger than these Western countries at the moment, and secondly, I think that, like, they have to weigh that potential short-term harm against the long-term harm of setting a precedent that you can hugely mess with China's revenue without any consequences to you. I think that China will look at that weighing mechanism and decide in favor of the thing that harms them less in the long run and will be willing to take a short-term hit to their economy. Before I go on to explain the impacts of this, I'll take Lorenzo's POI.
Yeah, so the reason the data point matters is because even if all of the current data is sold to Facebook or whoever, there's a lot of future data that will no longer be gathered. And to be honest, who cares if Facebook loses some profit? I think that this is within the purview of fiat power.
No, it's not in the purview of fiat power because Facebook is going to massively lobby the US government in order to prevent this from happening. It takes far more political will to, like, do something that harms the revenue of already entrenched elites in the US rather than elites in China where, like, the US government doesn't have nearly the same incentive to kowtow to them. And in terms of the future data, like, that just doesn't make sense. Like, they will continue getting data from Facebook or whatever social media company pops up to replace TikTok. That was weird. Okay, so let's talk about the specific impacts of this. So I think there are a few. I think firstly, like, like, this makes it harder to end the trade war at the point at which there is now a massive new grievance, and both sides have put more tariffs on each other. This means less jobs, this means fewer people lifted out of poverty, etc. This is the kind of impact that I think outweighs the stuff on data privacy, because this is people like literally starving at the point at which they don't have jobs because business isn't happening anymore. This is consumers not having access to food because they're very poor and it was already unaffordable to begin with. When sanctions are put on things like grain, then people can no longer afford food in these countries. But I think the especially important delta here is in the EU, where this would be the first major sanctions of this kind. And specifically, I want to talk about how FDI is really important in places like the Balkans in terms of developing these countries, or for that matter, in places like Africa, which OG did include in their model as places that would ban these companies, making it significantly likely that China will continue to invest there in the future. We think that Chinese FDI, because it has no conditions, is really important in helping these countries to develop, and we think that losing that development is a serious blow to alleviating poverty in these countries. And specifically, we want, China wants to be a global hegemon, and it knows that debt trapping its partners is not a good thing to do if it wants to do that, which is why we didn't really see that anymore after Sri Lanka. And we want these countries to be able to play China and the West off of each other, essentially accepting whichever one gives you the better deal. We think that it is bad for these countries to push China away in such a major way by cutting off a major source of revenue for them. Oppose.
Thank you. Now calling up the Deputy Prime Minister. Nope, sorry. Calling up the Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh. Can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to talk about two things. First, I have roughly 6 reasons why it is that retaliation is just absolutely unlikely. And secondly, I want to talk about why, even if it is the case that retaliation happens, the harms that these social media apps currently pose on American democracy and pose on overall propaganda are so large that even if retaliation happens, that is something that we are willing to swallow. So, on to retaliation first. The first important piece of context that Naomi provides to you is that currently the Chinese economy is incredibly unstable. Not unstable, has been remarkably weakened in the wake of the COVID pandemic. They currently face a banking crisis, and notably, things such as sanctions and tariffs that opposition are worried about hurt them too. There was no initial will for them to engage in the trade war, and it's unlikely that this is the tipping point that wants them to continue to engage in the trade war. The second thing that I want to note, though, is that things such as Huawei have already been banned in a variety of countries, and there was no meaningful retaliation that came from China against those countries as well. So opposition needs to identify for us why this is a unique tipping point compared to other Chinese companies. Third of all, though, fear of future retaliation for non-social media based companies that China owns also mean that it is unlikely that China will do this, i.e., if China substantially retaliates against a country, it is unlikely it is likely that, especially when you have something such as the erratic Trump administration, that they knock out other Chinese companies that are non-tech related as well, and that threat means that it's unlikely that China wants to retaliate. The next thing I want to mention, though, is that currently public perception overall and internationally and both domestically within China is currently incredibly anti-China and anti-Chinese government in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. This is especially given the case that there has been a lot of public perception that the Chinese government has largely mishandled that situation. So it's unlikely that the Chinese government can attack the United States on the international front, given that the United States is in a unique position right now in which there is a very much an anti-China narrative within international relations. The final thing that so it's incredibly unlikely that they attack or launch any public attacks as well. The final thing I want to note, though, is that currently the Chinese government bans US-based social media apps. So you can always spin the narrative that this is proportionate to the exact same thing that the Chinese government is currently doing. And there will be no chance that the Chinese government allows things such as Facebook and Google to maintain within the Chinese government. So given that's the case, this is proportionate. And when it is proportionate, it's a lot harder for Chinese leaders to critique the United States for doing something along these lines. So for all these reasons, it is incredibly and remarkably unlikely that China retaliates. Unfortunately, that is what most of opening opposition's case is entirely hung on. Quickly on this FDI analysis. Look, this is just assertive, right? Because in a world in which the Chinese government is trying to expand and be a global hegemon, whether or not an African nation bans TikTok is not going to be the tipping point for that. They have far more incentives to continue with things such as BRI and FDI. This is just an incredibly unlikely argument. Okay, on to our case now. The first thing I want to engage with is this analysis about like Facebook and other American companies still selling data towards the Chinese government. 3 things to note here. Number one, I agree with Lorenzo here. I think it's relatively within our fiat power to be able to do this. Secondly, though, I think that it's also far more easy to do this, even if you don't buy that we have the fiat power, right? Like, it just makes more sense that you can spin the political narrative that since we have banned TikTok and WeChat, there is a current precedent within American politics to protect American data at all costs. The other thing I want to note, though, is that they are far more easy to regulate compared to MNCs within China that have to go through foreign courts. Things like Facebook currently have been under massive scrutiny right now, and it is far more easy to regulate Facebook when it is within your own jurisdiction. The final thing I want to note, though, is even if we can't stop American companies from selling data, this is a question of scope and skill, because it is substantially more limited to sell the consumer data of a small subset of Americans towards China for consumption purposes compared to literally making sure that the Chinese government is able to access the data of everyone. So, first of all, in terms of the threat towards the data, we told you that things such as consumption preferences, things such as registering, which includes your personal information, and the fact that this app linked to others means that there are many mechanisms through which the Chinese government is able to access consumer data. The consequences of that are, number one, more of an ability for election meddling, i.e. if you thought that Russia was bad, it is currently significantly more likely to be worse. I want to note here that, by the way, many of our impacts don't just apply to the United States as well. Things such as election meddling within Cambodia and within Laos means that it is far more and substantially more able to happen when it is that the Chinese government is able to participate in this. Secondly, though, this massively harms the Chinese American diaspora. Like, I've heard countless stories and have individuals that have personally experienced when they have had their WeChat and their Facebook linked, they post something on Facebook of like Winnie the Pooh to make fun of Xi Jinping, and their family back home in China has gotten letters about it from the government. This is significantly worse when individuals oftentimes talk about things such as the Uyghur conflict or compare Xi Jinping to an imperial individual given the removal of things such as election term limits. The way in which China is able to access this consumer data is actively unsafe and oftentimes has been able to threaten dissent within China far, far more, or even within the diaspora who lives inside of the United States but might have family in China that they can afterwards threaten. The next thing I want to talk about is flooding and worsening the content. Now, I know what opposition is going to say, right? Opposition is going to say, oh, if it is that they participate in a lot of flooding, other companies will go through and beat them out. There's 2 reasons why Chinese companies will always outcompete these other American companies. Number one is because these trends are remarkably new, which means that you don't have alternatives that allow for the free speech to proliferate that is also able to create a sustainable business model. And secondly, because the Chinese government both pours in massive capital and they have a large consumer base. So those alternatives that should exist in our world do not exist on oppositions. But the consequence of that is the flooding with fake news and the censoring of active anti-China content. These are massive, massive consequences. And even if retaliation happens, which is remarkably unlikely, these things alone are reason enough to ban the app. Proud to stand on Gov.
Cool, thank you. And now calling up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The point that OG missed is that they provide no response to our weighing. That is to say that if we prove that Chinese retaliation happens, and I will prove that systematically, thus preventing people from being pulled out of poverty and gaining access to funds through Chinese FDI, stuff that is crucial for the development of many countries around the world and harming the ability of these nations to triangulate, OO should win the debate. I'm going to bring you 2 responses, first on data privacy, second on the tipping point, that I'm going to mech out for you precisely why retaliation occurs, why it's better on our side of the house. Let's talk about data privacy first. Note that to a vast extent, the amount of data that is able to be gathered by the Chinese government is incredibly symmetric in this debate. That is to say that while Gov can fiat that they ban TikTok, that they ban WeChat, that they ban social media apps, it is not within the purview of their fiat power to say that all social media companies can no longer sell data to China, which is a huge source of their revenue, to indigenous social media companies within these nation states, within the USA, and so on and so forth. Note that this likely kills a lot of indigenous social media networks within nation states that don't have the same like ad revenue base that like Facebook has necessarily to compensate for that type of things, but it probably also harms Facebook to an incredible extent because Facebook is reliant to a tremendous extent on this consumer base from the Chinese government and from these Chinese industry firms that ultimately purchase this data in order to continue to provide its services for free. We think it is likely that they end up charging money for their services. We think it likely makes Facebook more inaccessible to a lot of people, making social media buy-in a lot harder, contrary to the weighing that we get from opening government. But more importantly, even if it is within their fiat power, we think that China will do other things to secure this data that are even more problematic and crucially harder to regulate. What does this look like? We think firstly, it looks like directly resorting to blackmailing leaders of nation states, something they do in the status quo in order to get preferential investment deals and things like that, and something that will likely continue and probably increase at the point at which they no longer have access to this data through any means. Secondly, we think it means they ramp up espionage efforts, which can be just as effective on social media influencing elections, CF Cambridge Analytica, and everything that happened in Trinidad when like the firm attempted to influence elections there. But we think comparatively, the issue is there's a vastly greater degree of scrutiny on TikTok in the status quo, which means that the US state and other nation states are able to see what types of data is being gathered by the Chinese government because they can do the same type of demographic analysis on the data users of TikTok because everybody on TikTok has a public profile that they can ultimately analyze and that the US government can trawl. What this means is that you get crucially better regulation of the amount of information that the Chinese government has, which means that insofar as the delta in this debate is influence on like the amount of the nation state's ability to like kind of influence the degree to which China has control over their information, we think you get greater understanding of the degree of information that China possesses. We think it's vastly worse when they go underground, resort to espionage, resort to other methods like hiring shady firms to troll Western social media companies to gather information. We think it's worse on their side of the house. You embolden pernicious practices rather than get scrutiny. But secondly, why is this the tipping point? We think firstly, China wants to disincentivize these types of moves in the future. We think it's highly likely that they will like ultimately make this a move in the first place in order to set a barrier and things like that. The difference between this and Huawei bans in the past, to respond to Chris's point, is that TikTok and WeChat cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and a global ban, which is what they are essentially attempting to fiat from OG, or at least regional bans in huge markets like the EU and I don't know, the African Union, likely mean that they are far comparatively worse to Huawei bans, which are A, sporadic and limited in scope, and B, typically limited only to 5G networks. Then they say that you discourage innovation on their side of the house. We think this is ridiculous. Firstly, we think that there's less competition in the status quo in places where Chinese social media apps are banned because there's less incentive for these companies to innovate. We think that the reason why TikTok was able to capture market share in the first place was precisely because lagging innovation on the part of US companies. We think you embolden and increase that lack of innovation on their side of the house. We also just think you get more scrutiny generally on these types of apps. We think that's probably better for intelligence gathering and things like that. I'll take you a little bit later. Now let's mech out Chinese retaliation. I think this is really important. Firstly, why do we think it's likely that they'll retaliate? There are 4 mechanisms I want to flag for you here. Firstly, we think it's highly likely that the Chinese social media apps being banned will demand a response from the CCP. This is because a huge amount of the expansionist policies they have pursued through their aggressive forms of diplomacy called war warrior and things like that derive a huge amount of legitimacy from the ability for Chinese social media apps to be influential globally. We think that there are forces within the CCP that help bolster Xi and his wolf warrior diplomacy in the first place, means that they'll demand retaliation, putting pressure on him to look strong and crack down, which we think is the reason why this retaliation happens. Secondly, we think WeChat is indeed hugely influential in the Chinese diaspora. The thing that Chris misses is that WeChat is often the only app which diaspora Chinese can communicate with people on the mainland with, because precisely Google and Facebook are banned in those countries. This means that the diaspora, which likely will, and many in the cases are not particularly in favor of like Western governments and sometimes do support the Chinese state, will, insofar as they do believe in that, put pressure on the Chinese state to retaliate through their relatives in China. We think that increases the pressure likely relative to the status quo. Thirdly, in the absence of intervention, the market will be flooded with American clones of these apps, like Instagram Reels, which is the new thing that got promoted recently. We think that the Chinese revenue will, the loss of Chinese revenue will demand a response, because the heads of TikTok's and Tencent's hugely influential organizations within China and members of the CCP, who are members of the CCP, will advocate to retaliate against governments that ban TikTok. And fourthly, and this is crucial, in China in the status quo, one of the largest bulwarks against Chinese retaliatory policies to the West, e.g. the reason why China hasn't implemented tariffs against Volkswagen and firms like that, is because there's a large population of Chinese elites that have critical business deals from Shanghai with places like Vancouver and places like Toronto and places like Detroit. We think that at the point at which you ban these social media apps, which is a huge source of revenue for these individuals, you disempower them vis-a-vis other elites within those states that want to pursue more isolationist, nationalist, and tariff tendencies. You lose a bulwark against Xi Jinping implementing the type of policies that currently would exist were it not for these types of deals that gain this type of legitimacy. Before I explain precisely what this retaliation looks like, Chris is dying to get a POI in.
So given a myriad of other things that impact relationships, retaliation is likely to be short-term versus a very long-term harm of the flooding of content of Chinese access to our data. How do you respond to that weighing?
I think here's the weighing on this. Firstly, the data harm is symmetric because there are other means of gathering data that are even more pernicious and less scrutinized. But even if it is the case that ultimately this was like, there are other tipping points that might accrue and that this is a short-term harm, we think that the massive retaliatory measures that they are likely to implement likely mean that there are vastly greater problems on your side that has to contend with, even if they're short-term. What do these retaliations look like? Firstly, we think it looks like China pulling funds for infrastructure and development projects throughout the developing world. Note that many of these countries are reliant on Chinese aid relative to the West because they do not impose mechanisms of conditionality and they have more foreign aid to spread around generally. If you get less things like roads, we think you get less things like medical infrastructure being developed in developing nations that pull out at the point at which this ban is implemented. Secondly, we think you get increased tariffs on European nations. You think you get tariffs implemented on European companies like Volkswagen and things like that that harm the ability of European firms to triangulate between the West and China and seek out preferential deals that ultimately lead to like accruing better financial capital for these nation states. Lastly, we think you lose a lot of FDI. In places like the Balkans, we think this means investors likely pull out, which means you get less exchange between Chinese tech companies and their employees, and you get fewer funds for these associations, business associations, and so on and so forth. When you weigh this up at the end of the day, you have to understand that the Chinese economy is not profoundly untenable. They have a high degree of likelihood to retaliate. We proved that. That's why we win.
Thank you. Now, calling up the member of government.
All right, is everyone ready? On closing government, we defend the neoliberal order, which is the idea that countries have to trade with each other on fair terms. It is unfair and absurd that we're allowing China to spread its tentacles, continue to gain profit from users worldwide by peddling their social media apps in every single country, while not allowing those countries to also gain profit from operating in China. We see this as a trade debate. That's why we're going to be forwarding to you one argument about how this is a way to correct the unfair terms of trade between China and the rest of the world. And our second argument will be about China's moral complicity and how you should not be furthering China's ability to carry out human rights abuses. But first, let's deal a bit with what we heard in opening half. First, OO talked about the idea that China will somehow retaliate, but they do not tell us how China will retaliate. The problem is that the things that China could do to retaliate to this ban has already happened. So you ban TikTok and WeChat, China might be like, oh, we're gonna ban your social media companies. Oh wait, we've already done that. So China cannot actually retaliate in any way that meaningfully responds to this policy. We actually see this case as a form of US and like the rest of the world retaliating against China's decades of abusive bans on other companies operating on their soil. The second thing I want to deal with, OO, is this idea that there will be harms to the rest of the world because China will pull investment out of the countries and people will starve. There are so many logic links here that have not been completed. They're trying to say that the person in Laos will now starve because they benefit so much from Chinese investment, which will now then pull out because TikTok and WeChat are somehow the biggest source of the CCP's revenue. First of all, it's not. The CCP gets its revenue from like from its profits from state-owned enterprises, from political donations, and from taxes, not from like TikTok or from Tencent. Second of all, I think China cares enough about its BRI investment that they're not going to reduce it just because two of their companies have taken a hit. It is so important to them to be seen as a new hegemon that they'll probably continue to do this. But third of all, even if this does happen, we think this might actually be a good thing. You know, China's BRI investment in many countries has led to debt trap diplomacy that leads to them going down a rabbit hole of like, you know, a rabbit hole of like future generations being harmed because of this. And if China has less ability to like, you know, allow abuses of minority groups in certain parts of the world, or have its BRI investment get countries into debt, this might actually be a good thing. So I'm not clear how OO's argument either works. I'm also not clear why it matters. Even if it does work, it's actually a benefit. Let's talk a bit about how we will outweigh OG. OG's main argument is that China uses these apps to do election interference. But I don't think they've shown, first of all, why this is a unique harm to China-owned social media companies and why China can't just do this with Facebook and other US-owned or foreign-owned social media companies. Opposition pointed this out, and I don't think OG gave a sufficient response. I think OG's case is much more an argument for regulating social media companies, not one about Chinese-owned companies specifically. We're going to be bringing to you arguments specific to why Chinese ownership matters and to why Chinese ownership most uniquely affects where the profits and the assets that come uniquely with ownership goes, and how we're going to correct this unfair situation. But second of all, I also don't think OG did enough to show why their arguments are impactful. It's not clear why this affects elections in a way that is principally or democratically unfair, seeing as people can still cast their vote freely. And also they talked a bit about domestic impacts to people in China when TikTok uses them to spread propaganda, but this motion doesn't take place in China, so some of their biggest arguments don't actually apply. So let's talk about this debate and our arguments. First, about how China and the rest of the world have currently a very unfair situation of trade and of commerce and of economic goods between them right now, right? It's absurd that China doesn't allow, it would be absurd if a country did not allow another country to export goods to them, but force you to take in all of their goods so that they can benefit from selling it to you. That is exactly the situation that's happening right now, because Facebook, Google, Gmail, and also this nascent social media companies in the developing world that OO talked about can't actually operate in China. We're standing on the side of those companies and the people that they benefit. Now, what are the harms when China does not allow an equality of trade or exchange to happen between social media companies? First, there is lost money to US social media companies and to other social media companies in the rest of the world, right? Recognize that it's a one-to-one trade-off. If users were not using TikTok, they would be using Snapchat or Instagram. If they were not using WeChat, they would be using WhatsApp. So every user that gets to use a Chinese social media-owned company is taking away investment and revenue that would otherwise go to US social media companies or those in the rest of the world. Second, it's a loss of the most important form of assets in social media companies, which is user data, right? Recognize that the cash cow of the digital or internet economy is user data, because companies can use them to sell to corporations and gain massive profit from it, right? The most valuable thing about the user data is not actually that they're used for nefarious political means, because for like every 2 billion users whose data is collected, only like maybe 5,000 have actually been affected by like Cambridge Analytica. But the biggest and most valuable impact of this user data is actually the billions of dollars of profit and revenue that they bring to these companies when they're allowed to be sold to retail corporations, to marketing companies, or to ad companies. And China is siphoning that money away from Facebook and from other social media companies that operate in the rest of the world in a very unfair way, because they're not allowing those companies to do the same in Chinese markets and to gain the same profit from it. It's unfair competition, and we need to put a stop to that by banning Chinese social media companies until they release the ban on US social media companies and the rest of the world. Before I continue, let's take OO's POI.
So we were actually very specific about how retaliation looks like. It looks like additional sanctions, the removal of FDI, making it more difficult to end the trade war. Are your principal benefits of fairness in which country gets business really worth pushing hundreds of thousands of people into poverty?
Yeah, the first thing is that the sanctions that they would apply would probably be specific to the sector that this ban is on, and that is social media, but China's already placed sanctions on foreign social media, so it's somewhat ineffective. Also, I'm unclear why China would sanction goods that are necessary for them, like, for instance, oil or US agriculture, right? Like soybeans, for instance, because they actually need them. So you did not explain the specific kinds of sanctions that will be applied, and we did the work for you by saying the social media sanctions that could be applied have already been applied. So how do we solve the problem? First of all, we at least end this unfair profiteering on China's part. And we allow companies that are playing by the rules of the neoliberal world order. That is, you allow us to trade with you if we will trade, like trade is reciprocal, right? And that's a good thing because it sets an important precedent for the kind of world order we want to build, which is that countries cannot arbitrarily ban foreign companies from operating on their soil and expect you to allow them to do the same. Second of all, we also use this as an important form of leverage to force China in the future to allow US social media companies to operate in China. If they will be as harmed as OO says by this policy, I think it's likely it will prompt them to reconsider their current ban on US tech companies operating in China, leading to a fairer global economic system we're very proud to propose.
Thank you. Now calling up the member of the opposition.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm just gonna ask for POIs that people say them because I'm not gonna be looking at the screen, but please do not harass me. Otherwise, I will call you out publicly. And that won't be fun. Okay. 1 second while I set up my timer. Okay, so I'm actually surprised that most of the, or actually every other team in this debate has seemingly missed the point. Nothing is going to change with regards to the way that China operates in terms of like not following the neoliberal world order just because we show a principled unwillingness to tolerate it. Nothing is going to change in terms of data usage because notably this is symmetrical with other companies that are often US owned, right? Pointing to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. What will change though is also not retaliation. I think that that's been like effectively refuted, but whether or not people can meaningfully access information under oppressive regimes and be able to express their own identities and access important, not only information that legitimizes democracy in their own worldview, but also allows them to access who they are as a person. So what we're going to do is briefly outframe OO, then respond to CG, then respond to OG, then give another case. Okay, so the thing with OO is just that the entire case is on international relations being bad for economics. It's not real. Gov points out this has minimal impact. The US has already banned stuff like Huawei, as they pointed out, without this happening. We're going to give a realistic case. On to CG, notably they have to actually prove that like they're going to get change in terms of China legalizing these US or Western companies. They didn't do that at all, and I think they're unable to do that, right? Because given the way that China's acted right now, if so, we can probably just outweigh this principle by saying that the benefits probably just accrue to like, I don't know, tech CEOs or people who are relatively well off in terms of like fair trading. Also, it's unclear that this is a zero-sum game, right? Like people use Snap and Insta and TikTok. Even if it is the case, there's probably just like competition. Like if these apps were more profitable, American companies would make them and outcompete TikTok. Like the free market probably deals with that. It also implies that countries should always sell internally. But globalization has been like a net good for cheaper goods. So I don't know where their principle actually stands. And on these apps, I think companies can also advertise for cheaper than they ever could. So like there's probably a benefit to like better trading. It's just not clear that this is the tipping point for that, and I'm unclear where the principle weighs out in this debate as opposed to very serious impacts on people. Now let's talk about OG. So don't POI because I'm about to engage with you right now. Alternative apps have the same harms, right? Like the entire OG case is about why the collection of data is bad. The problem is they don't prove why the incentives of China are comparatively worse than any other country. To win this clash, we just have to prove that any country who makes these domestically, these apps will become equally bad and it's a wash. So like American apps also collect data. They use it to target ads, often have this in line with corporate interests that tends to be in line with political incentives. They're also really bad at regulating, right? Because the harms of terms and conditions being opaque is symmetrical to these places. This is how Cambridge Analytica happened and then everyone forgot. Notably, this is like never going to happen because corporations know that most people care about using social media apps more than they care about having their data sold because that's an unclear, opaque harm. And also because of the tragedy of the commons, right? The harms accrue on a broad scale of governments and elections that people individually don't even care about. Notably, they don't always even vote. But benefits of social media accrue to individuals, so you can really never get regulation of all these apps. Therefore, we should make the trade-off of how people use them best. Also, so I want to point out that domestic companies having data is probably worse because they have more direct stakes in US elections. So they probably use that even worse domestically. It's not clear why their argument is so important. So now let's talk about why international actors on apps is really important. The logical extension of OG is that every nation should ban apps that aren't their own. We're going to explain why international usage of apps is good. This also exists under the model of like Microsoft buys out TikTok, because China will then ban that Microsoft version of TikTok as they have with past social media. So I think this looks like leftist activism and democracy being able to spread. You can have videos on like gay or socialist TikTok, or just being able to communicate between the West and China, which is like what WeChat allows you to do, right? Like actually being able to convey information. Notably, you aren't going to get massive amounts of censorship in these cases. It's probably going to be really minimal, unlike every other kind of information you get under an oppressive state, because corporate incentives need to reduce censorship in order to maintain market in democratic countries like the US that expect to have greater access to things like freedom of speech and value that, right? So this is like the only channel of non-censored, or at least minimally censored, like free flow of information that Chinese people are able to access under the status quo. Same with every other country in which they would probably support also banning their social media apps. This is important because you get a young voter base of people who's going to be the future organizers or future voters in countries that aren't China and are democratic, to be able to like see the value of democracy, to be able to pressure for sanctions if they don't live in China. For example, US residents being able to get access to Chinese people talking about their lived experience, more likely to do things like care about them as people as opposed to have xenophobia, and pressure for sanctions against, like, for example, internment camps for Uyghurs. But also I think within China, you're more likely to organize more, because it's not that people don't like BLM or don't like feminism in China, right? There are grassroots organizations, but you have to push through propaganda. You have to push through like the collective action problem of knowing that the state might like backlash against you. So you need to have broad spread access to information, broad spread capacity to organize. You can't do that if you're operating in a world where you're unable to access that kind of information. So I think that it's also important in terms of support spaces, right? This is like probably the most likely impact in this debate. The Me Too movement, LGBTQ communities to deal with eating disorders, right? Oftentimes in these countries, these things don't have like widespread networks where people can talk about their lived experiences and know that they're not alone. It's as simple as being able to like know what being non-binary means. If you feel like you're gender non-conforming and you're trying to find a label that's meaningful to you, to be able to access support groups, to be able to get information on like sex ed and safe sex, like really, really important things that you're unable to get in their world. This is so important when you live under a oppressive regime and the change is very long coming, right? It might come in the future. I think we have the best mechanism to make it come in the future when we expose people to democracy and push through the propaganda that says the West is always bad, right? Because people are accessing pro-democracy content. But I think also just being able to talk about your identity is something that impacts everyone under an oppressive state that doesn't accept them. But let's talk about why this also sets a harmful precedent to banning social media in the future. Because I think this makes it far, far easier for states that have never, ever done this, right? Like the US, to justify banning social media in the future and being selective about which companies they ban, like Trump banning TikTok because people protest him on there. This is even more true in less democratic countries like India that presumably also exist under this motion and have already banned TikTok and shown that they're willing to do that, right? This creates a precedent for massive amounts of censorship that previously were pressed back by values of free speech. But I also think it prevents us from being able to do things like call out lack of free speech in China, do things like what OG and CT wanted in terms of advocating for US companies not being banned in China, because that way the Chinese government just points to this and says, haha, look, the US goes back on their values whenever it's convenient, right? The US goes back on their values because this is a failure of democracy. No democracy will give you that freedom of speech that you crave. This also allows you to galvanize anti-US sentiment. I think it prevents the meaningful change in the future and also allows you to crack down on free speech. We're proud to oppose.
Great, thank you. And now calling up the government whip.
Yep. Yeah, just give me 1 second. Sorry, my Wi-Fi has been a bit spotty, so I'm just changing rooms. Give me just 1 second. All right. Can people hear me fine?
Yep.
Great. All right. So, okay. 3, 2, 1. I'll begin now. So I'll begin by refuting CO because I really don't think they have much of a case. The first thing they say is you can communicate between the West and China, and this is good. Guys, there is an army of bureaucrats and technocrats employed by the CCP designed to make sure that every single thing that shows up on Chinese social media passes what they accept, what they would accept as something that is okay and does not deserve to be censored. These aren't minimally censored. This is where the entire censorship apparatus of the CCP is designed to cover. So you don't get very nice narratives coming from the West to China or from China to the West about what Chinese people are actually like. But the only narratives you get are people saying, oh, look how great the CCP is. Your government shouldn't do anything to stop these human rights abuses, which aren't even happening, by the way. Okay, if there is any sort of nice identity group thing that happens on TikTok that Chinese people can access, then it is already happening in China because the CCP allows it to happen. This argument does not exist. The second argument that they give is that this justifies banning social media, and this is bad because it might go against the principles of democracy. No, it doesn't justify banning social media. It actually sets a pretty clear criteria for what types of social media it is okay to ban. That criteria is this social media owned by China? If the answer is yes, then it's okay to ban it. If the answer is no, then it's not okay. Done. There's no ambiguity here. That doesn't justify anything other than what the government is already defending. So this argument doesn't have any extra impact or extra impetus. CO is out of this debate. Let's talk a little bit about the things that actually matter. So, I'll also note, CO just explicitly contradicts OO because of all of OO's cases, how very mechanistic reasons why China is going to retaliate on the international stage. And then CO just says, no, they're not going to do that. I don't actually think that counts because that is a literal definition of knifing. But let's talk explicitly, no thanks. Let's talk explicitly about some important aspects of our case, because I think that they interact in interesting ways with what OO says, and Colin flags this explicitly. That is, in many situations, we are actually okay with China pulling out of the international stage. We are okay with China doing things that might antagonize the rest of the world. You know why? Because China's a really bad country. Worse, I would say, than other big countries. Maybe because they're doing things like, genocide, systematically imprisoning political opponents, trying to take over other countries, killing Indian soldiers, and trying to invade the South China Sea, even though they have no right to it. So I think the types of things that would happen if China retaliates by pulling out of other countries would actually be good, because a lot of developing countries are saddled with outrageous amounts of debt because of One Belt, One Road, infrastructure, FDI, programs that are supposedly nice. Guys, China isn't a good actor. You know how it gets these loans in the first place? Often through blackmail or bribery of foreign officials in very, very corrupt regimes that don't actually have investment schemes that are designed to benefit the vast majority of people. So if the effect of this motion is China pulling out of these countries, it means that this is something good because they are less likely to engage in these nefarious relationships in the future, but also because it's likely to lead to those countries making decisions that are more likely to improve the humanitarian situation in China. For instance, you're less likely to have deals that allow Hong Kong extradition. So if you have, or extradition to China. So if you have anti-China activists posting anti-China things in those countries, it is less likely that China is going to be able to extradite them and put them in prison. It means that you have countries that have, for instance, more support for going against China's increasing influence in the South China Sea. It means that you have less of a likelihood that these countries are going to turn a blind eye to what's happening in Xinjiang, for instance. So if there is to be any hope for a long-term neoliberal future in which countries around the world together decide to do things to stop China's ruthless, terrible, evil expansion and human rights violations, it will only come in a world where you are able to say, I am going to take a stand and separate from China in this way or that way. This doesn't mean that immediately all of these things stop happening, but that if we start creating separations between other countries and China, then this is the way that we get these outcomes in the long run. Yeah, I'll take a POI from OO.
So I would posit that the US also commits massive human rights violations and also acts neo-colonially. Don't you think it's best, as we said in both of our speeches, if developing nations can play the US and China off of each other, choosing which one is best and forcing them each to offer a better deal? That seems to be the only way we can hold both actors to account.
I literally don't think, okay. First of all, no, the United States is not committing genocide explicitly against an ethnic group and making sure that this ethnic group doesn't exist 10 years. It's not even comparable. I don't think that this is a fair argument just because obviously there are big problems in the US. That doesn't mean they are the same. Secondly, I don't understand how you're actually able to play these countries off each other. I don't think that the United States government cares enough about the presence of Twitter in Cambodia to actually change one of its own policies because Cambodia starts negotiating with them. Like, this doesn't make any sense. The role of, I'm sorry, this argument was just not mechanized, and I don't think it actually has much weight in this debate. I think the only real argument remaining from OO is something like, oh, the Chinese government can go underground and they'll start doing things like cyber attacks and other bad things because they can't do it overtly through social media now. This kind of concedes that the social media is being put to a bad purpose if the alternative is that. But I think I also like to point out if these cyber attacks and bad things are effective, then China is probably doing them anyway. And so I don't really see what the impact of this argument is, because if this argument is true, then it's already happening in the status quo. All right, 1 second. Oh, also, I think there's a fairly reasonable principled argument to be made here that the profit gained by Tencent and WeChat goes directly toward helping the CCP carry out massive human rights abuses because these companies make contributions to the CCP and because they literally collect taxes on them, and also because Tencent helps spread very, very dangerous Chinese propaganda, such as doing things like making patriotic video games or whatever. So I think there's a fairly strong principled argument to be said, hey, the United States shouldn't be helping perpetuate these particular human rights violations. So it might be true that the US does bad things and there's a lot of things to improve here. But if you have one other really, really bad thing that you are already helping and already perpetuating, I think it's a pretty clear case where you can say, no, I don't want a part of that. If this means China gets less involved with the rest of the world, that is a good thing. And I think importantly, even if it doesn't, it creates a situations by which you give the United States leverage in a way that can actually help changes in the future. And it allows the United States to take a principled stance and to at least in some way say, this has got to stop happening and we're going to stop literally directly funding it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now calling up the opposition whip.
Okay. Okay, so panel, recognized by the end of this debate, the only reason the Gov bench is given as to why China is a unique actor who shouldn't be able to collect data that is used by international users is that they commit genocide and imprison dissenters. But I'd like to make a note that right now under the status quo, the US is currently imprisoning protesters in the BLM movement. Canada is systematically killing off indigenous people or ignoring them or not giving them the money that they need on which to survive or depriving them of their land. It is still unclear to me at the end of this round why uniquely China is going to do malicious things with this data that is not going to be done in a comparative world. Why the owners of Snapchat, when they have access to data that they mine for advertisement money, aren't also going to be using this data to do every single thing that the Gov bench has said is bad within this round. That means that if this is true, the question in this round is not a question as to whether or not social media by China could lead to harmful data collection if the comparative is data that is being collected equally badly and no one on Gov bench took on the burden of actually proving why it's going to be collected better in the comparative. The question then defaults to whether or not by the logical extension of the Gov case, that means that no domestic actor should enable a social media platform to exist within their country that is being made by somewhere else. So Micaela and I pose to you that we think that there's a real question to be had as to whether or not international users should be able to be on the same social media platform and the types of precedent that this sets. I will go through the round, but I think that's like reframing of how we went. Okay, first question then, is the data collection actually going to be that harmful? So I have a note here that OO says that data is still going to be collected, but they never fill in the gap as to whether or not, how this weighs out in terms of how data is used by, let's say the US versus how it is used by China. That is where we come in extension. So how does this weigh out over the government bench? We tell you a few things. First, notably, the opening government case is this entire case that collection of data is bad, but they never once link it back to specifically how China uses it, right? They say, well, they have the potential to meddle in elections, but then they note that Russia also meddles in elections, right? Or the US, corporations that collect data can also use this to get in power a right-wing person if that's what helps their business interests, right? So we'd say that data collection is equally done by places in the US, and the notable weighing that Mick gave you that was never responded to by CG was the fact that specifically you as an actor within the US collecting data have more of an incentive to do all the harmful things of meddling in an election because you are more directly tied to the impacts of it than China is as an actor, because that election cycle directly affects your corporation and your corporate interests. Because if someone like Trump is in power, they're more likely to give you money or make it easier for your corporation to exist, right? So this means the question on data collection being bad at best is a wash within this round because it's going to be bad by all sides, but or at worst it's a wash, but at best it falls to our side because we tell you that collection is going to be used more and more malicious ways when it is done domestically. Okay, so that then means we shouldn't weigh out the stuff that they say, but rather we should weigh out the other two parts of our extension. Okay, first question then. The logical extension, notably, of the entire government case was that domestic companies should not enable social media to exist where data is collected externally. This means if the US has a Snapchat app, this means India shouldn't display Snapchat to anyone because the US might mine data off of it, right? So notably, the response we got from CG was insufficient because they say, well, China won't be able to have access to data. But our point was not just about China. Our point was about why we believe that principally, countries that are international in scope, people living within them, should still be able to use interconnected media spaces, right? I.e., I as a person living within Canada should be able to access a media platform that is ran by someone within Europe. But the logical extension of the Gov case is I shouldn't be able to do that because they might be able to mine my data as I'm doing it, right? So that was the framing of how this case falls into the round, and the response we got was insufficient because even if China blocks it and China does not enable people to view the apps that America makes, we'd say that other countries do enable it. So to a large extent, there's still a mixing pool of people within media applications, but the principled extension of the government bench is they would disallow that because they believe that every single domestic actor should disallow an application that is made by someone that is not their own. How then does the impacts of this weigh into the round? We'd say that the ability for you to mix with people has a bunch of implications that CG just failed to respond to, and I'll prove to you how they weigh in. The first thing we'd say is that if GovBench wants to make you an argument that China, under the status quo, harms minority groups regardless, we'd say the way up then is that if you unnecessarily ban a Chinese-ran media application, given that it's not any worse than a alternative corporation who's going to be producing this application and is uniquely banned on China as opposed to any other country, it probably just leads to increased xenophobia and hatred towards Chinese citizens, which we say should weigh out over the harms that happen internally, because China is always going to be oppressive to minority groups within their nation, but we as international actors have a unique ability to not increase the amount of xenophobia that occurs on the ground. We unnecessarily make the choice to ban an application purely because it is Chinese ran. And notably here, no one on Gov gave you specifics as to why China is uniquely bad. So they're just specifically increasing hatred towards Chinese people with it domestically, right? So right now in Canada, there was a lot of hatred when people said that COVID was a Chinese illness, right? So we'd say a similar thing will cross-apply at the point at which people don't understand the differentiation. So we are putting harms onto Chinese minorities and not actually solving for anything internally. That's one way up. The second way up, I would tell you, is that we have the chance to support marginalized people and find safe spaces that never would have ever occurred. How does this weigh out over the only real impact we get from CG? CG tells us at best they give money to a few CEOs. I literally do not care if a few CEOs get money if it means that internationally in places that don't have large LGBTQ movements, people are able to find a safe space. So if people living in India are able to access Canadian citizens or American citizens and have access to the safe spaces that they are creating, we would massively prefer that to a few rich people who already have money getting a few more dollars in their bank account. I'll take OG.
Yeah, so Naomi already discusses how this systematically advantages Chinese companies and outcompetes American companies. But the more important, so CG's extension, but the more important question, which one centers LGBTQ content more, WeChat or Facebook?
Okay, so like I don't really care about CG extension if Naomi already covered it. Great. I still think it's like ridiculous that you care about a few CEOs getting money. But in terms of WeChat versus Facebook, the premise of our case was that the logical extension of your case is that Facebook, if owned by the US, should be banned in China. Facebook, if owned by the US, should be banned in Europe. Facebook, owned by the US, should be banned in like every single country within Africa, or like it should be banned in India. That is the logical extension of your case because if the US mines data, it means that they can meddle in elections anywhere else, right? Because of that extension, we tell you that it's the question is if it is important for people elsewhere to be able to interact with a body of people that is not their own domestically because movement spread abroad. That is the weighing of the extension. I'm sorry if no one on GovBench wanted to engage with it. Last clash then on the precedent this sets. So Micaela tells you a few things. The only response we get is that you should ban things when China does it. A few things on what our actual extension was. It was like about banning social media platforms at large. So we tell you that the harms here and the weighing of it is if the it becomes now a lot easier for countries that are low-key democratic or not democratic at all to crack down on any dissent because they can be like, well, this type of social media was banned, so we can use that precedent, just ban any others, right? Which means that if the government cares about making any meaningful form of reform, they shouldn't enable the thing that stops reform, i.e. cracking down on dissent. I'm proud to stand on CO.
Thank you. Thank you all for a great round. Shreyas, you want to remind me of what the procedure is at this point?
Yeah, so you're just gonna leave the breakout room, and then in 15 minutes, one of us will come back to the main room and and then you can rejoin the breakout room, and we'll give the OA.
Good debate,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Good debate.
Thank you all for so thank you all for a great debate. We all really enjoyed it. Sorry for taking so long. That one's on me. Part of the reason it took so long, well, mainly was my time management issues on my part. But the other big reason is that all of our starters really well debated with like a few points just going out without like a lot of good clash. And our initial calls were fairly diverse, including like 1-4 splits. And in the end, we came to mostly a consensus, with just one non-consensus. So without further ado, give it. Everyone's going to get high speaks. Like when I say everyone, I mean literally everyone will be getting quite high speaks. So we ended up coming to first on a 2-1 was OG. Second on the losing end of the 2-1 is OO. Third is CG, and fourth is CO. All of the splits also being extremely narrow, even the ones that did not have actual like vote splits. So to give the RFP quite briefly, and I'm not exactly sure if when people want more feedback afterwards, if they just like DM one of us. I'm not exactly sure it works, but the TLDR on where the splits come. So first on starting with opening government. So all of us agree that we think it laid out a fairly reasonable case that is presents a lot of material. We thought there was the prime minister's speech just dumped a ton of material on us. But what we found was particularly valuable is that a lot of the material that came out at the beginning ended up becoming highly relevant throughout the entire debate. So when it comes, for example, with closing opposition, the challenge regarding whether or not certain things are China is a uniquely bad actor, we saw a lot of the analysis that was being used in regards to like why China in their government is uniquely linked to these companies, for example, became very relevant in adjudicating the rest of the debate. Moreover, we thought a lot of the rebuttal with opening opposition was also quite effective in challenging perhaps the extent of the scale of a lot of this retaliation. Bringing in opening opposition and explaining where we made the calls regarding opening government. We thought opening opposition did quite well, is that they had a very clear impact that although they may not have proved precisely passing a bright line, we're not entirely sure if they needed to pass a bright line to get some level of retaliation. We thought although some of their biggest impacts, for example, the ones with affecting investment elsewhere were either called into question due to political incentives or were challenged in the case of closing government, or whether or not that's even bad to begin with. We nonetheless thought that they had very clear impacts with very clear links chains. In particular, one of the disputes, not disputes, but where we disagreed on the OOOG call had to do with where we prioritized all of the type of privacy issues and whether or not we thought that was entirely mooted by some of the responses, meaning that they can buy data from other apps, and about the degree of the impacts to retaliation. But one thing I think we all agreed on the opening opposition does quite well is they have some reasons for retaliation that we don't think were effectively responded to by any of the other teams on the opposite bench. Namely things like if other countries just completely get away with banning this, then that's going to incentivize further retaliation against China or make China look weak, which gives China very strong incentives to be able to backlash. Nonetheless, why we came to OG over OO? I think a couple fold. Number one is that although the weakness of OG primarily comes with the scale of the impact, we think that they did an effective enough job challenging whether or not precisely the form in which the retaliation would occur would actually be that wide scale. For example, among many other responses, whether or not there is, like the Huawei example and things like that. And number two, we thought that there was a very highly plausible link that even if you do not buy the perhaps overpromised impacts that came out in various parts of the round, that they had a very clear link to this type of things like the censorship of a lot of topics. And number two, in the forms of retaliation against the rest of the Chinese diaspora, we felt that even if a lot of teams couldn't prove that they're meeting this very high burden that was set out for themselves, that a much lesser burden was required of relieving some of the impacts that we heard from the opening government. Third is that we thought that a lot of the material presented by opening government became extremely relevant in the context of material that we also heard from closing opposition. For example, the explanations of why these Chinese companies are uniquely bad vis-a-vis US companies and how they're tied in with things like that, and how all of that suggests that I think that their rebuttal holding through for the rest of the round and the substantially lower margin degree of confidence we need in their arguments in order for their impact to trigger, which is why I ended up coming to OG over OO. Although there was some disagreement, I think in large part because we thought the OO gets at least some of their impacts, and I think a lot of their impacts were weighed a lot better than what we did here from opening government. Bringing CG into the debate, we think CG does a number of things quite well. And largely, I think a lot of their rebuttal explaining the exact ways in which, for example, TikTok's money does benefit the CCP and the precise mechanisms by which the CCP operates, and how this does link to, say, the human rights abuses and other types of things. I think the best thing we hear from CG comes in both the members and the whip speech. A large, I think, or is coming primarily in their rebuttal. Nonetheless, we think they fall behind opening half for a couple reasons. Number one is that in regards to the extension, we thought that the burden of proof required to meet a lot of the impacts for them to be triggered was just substantially higher than they were able to meet. We weren't confident of precisely how much they would be now acquiescing to the liberal world order in order to be able to get markets for things like TikTok, etc. We thought there were a lot of links there that, although they might get some of it, they were effectively challenged by closing opposition and implicitly from opening opposition as well. Second, we were a little concerned on some of the rebuttal of whether or not it was, at least shades of it were heard in the opening half. For example, some of the ways in which these companies are integrated with the Chinese government, for example, that although it is substantially in greater detail than what we hear from opening half, that is not, that although the rebuttal is quite strong, the particularly unique parts of the rebuttal are not sufficiently different for enough to take it out over the much clearer impacts. We think you have a greater probability coming from opening opposition. Bringing in closing opposition and explaining the CG-CO split, where we had a lot of the discussion on. This was one that we had a fair amount of issues with, and as I foreshadowed earlier, we actually initially had differences on a 1. Someone on the panel had initially a 1 for CO as well. I think CO does a number of things quite well. Number 1 is that the stuff about communities being formed on apps like TikTok and WeChat, we really liked as an argument, in large part because it does have a much lower burden of proof that doesn't require, say, massive type of retaliation and can exist really in a vacuum without trying to take into account all the other various political concerns that were thrown out that might ameliorate or change China's actions. Also, we thought that CO does actually probably the clearest job in setting up what the different avenues for the debate are, like setting up in the much clearer organization with the questions about, like, is the data collection really that harmful? And then setting up what are the benefits of the apps themselves. We thought was a very helpful organization and was very good in the debate, which is why, even though despite the unfortunate fourth, the speaks are going to be very high. Nonetheless, why CG comes out over CO. We thought that although CO presents a number of arguments that are somewhat distinct, that a lot of them, they don't win on the merits, a lot of that material, namely of are these companies being Chinese uniquely bad in light of all the bad stuff that, for example, the United States and Canada does. We thought had a fair amount of shades of good rebuttal coming from OG, and then a particularly good more rebuttal coming out of closing government, suggesting of why not just that these Chinese apps are uniquely worse, but the particular relationship between the Chinese government and these companies suggests that even if the US and the Canadian governments have their own faults, that that those don't necessarily pervade onto or project onto the actual way in which these apps operate. Second, on the interconnected spaces, we thought that a lot of rebuttal coming from CG, in part that intertwines with their extension as well, about the degree to which other apps could fill those voids, we thought was particularly good. So although we don't believe that CG is getting a neoliberal world order in their view, the idea that other apps are able to fill this type of void does answer a very central question in the debate about the services that are literally provided by WeChat and by TikTok are not being provided, or could still be provided even in a world in which they are banned. That leaves the other impact that is particularly important also in light of the way in which CO frames their impacts in terms of, for example, people operating under oppressive regimes. When we hear a pretty good rebuttal actually starting with OG, that could cross-apply here, although OG obviously hadn't been the case, about how these apps being banned in China suggests that Chinese users aren't actually seeing content that's being produced by TikTok users in the West, and that combined with it suggests that isn't necessarily a big impact, and that although they have good reasons to suggest that censorship may not be as bad, at the end of the day, a lot of the censorship concerns that are brought up by OG do win out in the round, and although most of the discussion ends up focusing on data collection, a lot of the censorship concerns there are still enough to outweigh despite the rebuttal. Sorry for that being a little organized, because we just sort of have to call a very quick vote at the end. Didn't have enough time to organize my thoughts. That's ultimately where we came down to this split. It was very narrow, and I think all the speaks are going to be, I know all the speaks are going to be quite high. Thank you all for a great debate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.